Hi, I'm Lee Waller, and welcome to Motion Media Design in After Effects. Today, I want to take a look at recreating this animation right here. I had a few interests in creating this. One, I wanted to create some natural-looking transitions, some water-looking transitions, just using effects and track matte in After Effects, and then also the watery background. I wanted to see if how well I could recreate the bubbles, the water look there. So we're going to jump into this and recreate this animation. To start, I want to create a new composition. So composition, new composition, 1920 by 1080, 24 frames, and this is a 10-second composition. Going to hit OK on that. The first thing that we want to create will be the background. And that background is going to consist of a couple of different layers. The first layer, we're going to start off with a solid. So let's go to Layer, New, Solid, and 1920 by 1080. The color there, let's go with 3B59F5 on that hexadecimal right there. So that would be 3B59F5. Hit OK on that, and I'm going to hit OK right there, and we've got that solid, and I'm going to label that background. We're going to add an effect to it. Let's go up to Effect, Noise, and Grain, Fractal Noise. I'm going to definitely need to make a few adjustments here. We're going to keep the fractal type as basic. Let's keep also the noise type as soft linear. And then the contrast, let's drop that down to 51. And the brightness, let's bring that up to 15. After brightness, let's open up the transform properties here and adjust the scale from 100 up to 1960. We have a couple more adjustments. Let's drop down here to the blending mode and let's change that to hard light. And then we're going to animate the evolution here. So with your timeline indicator at the very beginning of the timeline, let's click the stopwatch for evolution there. We'll start off at 0x. Let's go to the end of the composition and then click on 0x right there and type in 1 and hit enter. And so now we've animated that background. All right, a couple of things that we're going to add to this background. First of all, what we need to do to add these next objects to this background is we're going to need to make this into a 3D layer. So right here with the switches, if you don't have the switches, if you're on modes, you can click the toggle switches and modes button right there. Bring up the switches, and we're going to need to make this background layer a 3D layer. That way, they'll respond to lights. We're going to add in 2 lights like we have here to help us create this glow look right here at the top. To do that, let's first go to Layer, New, Light. First light we'll add in will be a spotlight. The settings for that are spot, and we want to leave that color at white, and we're going to bring up the intensity to about 330. It's going to be pretty bright, and we want to open up the cone angle of this to 146, and the cone feather we'll leave it 50. So let's go to the fall off, and where it says none, click on that, and let's go to inverse squared clamp, and we'll leave the radius at 500. That'll set up our first light. Let's go ahead and hit OK on that. And of course you can see we have that glow right here in the middle, so we're going to need to adjust this light to bring that up. I'm going to go into the position properties or the transform properties for this. And we're going to change the point of interest and the position itself a little bit. So the point of interest, let's do this at 960 and a negative 477. And the z-axis will be 197. And then we'll go to our position. We'll set that at 960 by 178, and we'll leave it at a negative 666.7. We're going to need to make a few adjustments to the point of interest and the position for this light. So the point of interest, let's leave that at 960 on X. Let's change this Y setting to a negative 447. And the Z-axis, will change that to 197. Then for position on the X-axis, let's change that to 960. And on the Y-axis, let's change that to a negative 100. And we'll leave the Z-axis at a negative 666.7. Then we want to make an adjustment to the rotation on the X-axis. Let's change that to a negative 76 degrees. All right, the next thing we want to do is add another light. Let's go up to Layer, New, Light. And we want to add an ambient light, color white, and the intensity 15%. Hit OK on that. And we're just kind of filling in these areas here so it's not quite as dark. After this, we're going to add an adjustment layer. On that adjustment layer, we will have an effect on it that will affect everything underneath it. And this layer will remain on top of the composition. So let's go up to Layer, New, Adjustment Layer. And we're going to add an effect. The effect that we want is called Caustics, C-A-U-S-T-I-C-S. There it is, under Simulation. We'll grab that and bring it down and drop it onto our adjustment layer there. Let's go to the bottom setting here, and where it says Adjust, let's drop that down to Background. And we'll do the same on the water surface. Set that to Background. That's our background layer right there. And we'll make a few adjustments to this. So under the water settings, the water surface settings there, let's drop down to the surface opacity and change that to 0.81. And then the caustic strength to 0.02. Now we're going to make an adjustment to the layer itself so that this blends with everything underneath it. So on the adjustment layer there, if you're viewing the switches there, let's come down here and click Toggle Switches and Modes. We want to go to the modes, and that blending mode right there, we want to click on that and change that to color. Now we have a little more effect on our background, but this layer, like I said, is going to stay on top, so it's going to affect everything underneath it. Now we need to start adding in our bubbles. We'll do about 4 layers of bubbles. I'm going to click on the ambient light right here, and I'm going to go up to Layer, New, Solid. I'm going to label that Bubbles 1 and hit OK on that. That drops it in right above our ambient light 1 and below our adjustment layer there. We're going to need to add an effect to this solid layer. I'm going to go up to Effect, come down to Simulation, CC Particle World. And there you see we've got some particles being generated. Definitely going to need to make some adjustments on this. We'll jump in a few seconds in so we can see our particles. So let's go up here to our CC Particle World, and the first thing we're going to take a look at is the birth rate, and that's the number of particles coming out. And right now it's set at 2. I want to actually set that at 0.2. Click on that, 0.2, type that in, and we're going to change the longevity, the amount of time that these last. I'm going to change that to 15 seconds. And now we're going to go into the producer, and the producer is this area right here where all of the particles are coming out. We're going to change that. You see we have the position and the radius that we can adjust here on the producer. For X, we're going to leave it at 0. For Y, let's adjust that to 0.3. That drops the producer down here to the bottom. And for Z, we'll leave it there at 0 also. On the radius, we're going to increase the radius. So on the X radius, let's increase that to 0.615. You can see that that stretches that out from side to side there. We'll leave Y at 0.025, and then let's adjust Z to 0.1. That's just going to give us some depth on the producer there. All right, we're done with adjusting the producer, so we're going to go into the physics. We're going to leave the first animation at explosive. We'll leave the velocity at 1, the inherent velocity at 0, but we're going to change the gravity. The gravity is pulling the particles down, and we need these particles to go up. So to do that, we're going to go into a negative number, and our first number here will be negative 0.1. And so that sends our particles up. I'm going to render some of that out so we can take a look at it. And those particles are moving pretty fast, a little too fast for our bubbles. So what we're going to need to do is add in resistance to this. And let's bring that resistance up to 5. Now when we take a look at it, you'll see that they are moving slower. We'll make some more adjustments to this in just a few minutes, but for right now, let's go with that on physics. And let's jump into particle. The particle type that we want to use, we're going to adjust from line down to darken and faded sphere. And we're going to adjust the birth size and the death size. So for the birth size, let's change that to 0.2. And the death size to 0.15. And we'll leave everything else as it is. And let's take a look at this. Now we have an issue here. You can see that our particles are starting at the very beginning of the composition, and they're way down here at the bottom. We want this animation to start with particles filling the entire screen. We see here about around 9 seconds in the composition, we have a good many particles all the way to the top. So this is kind of where we want the animation to start. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this layer, I'm going to click and hold on it and drag it to the beginning right there, starting at the 9-second point. When we take a look at the beginning, you'll see now that we have particles or bubbles covering the entire screen, but our layer is much shorter now. So what we need to do is extend that out, and this animation will continue on. So now when we render, you see that the particles are filling the entire screen for the entire duration of the composition. There's a couple more things we want to do to blend these bubbles in. First thing we want to do is make sure that our bubbles layer is selected. Let's go to the blending mode here. You see the word normal. We want to change that to difference. And then we also want to add one more effect to this. So make sure that your layer is selected. Let's go up to Effect, and then we'll go to Perspective, and we're going to add a Bevel Alpha. We're going to adjust the thickness to 7, our light angle to 0, and then bring up the intensity to 1. And what that does is it kind of gives us an angle of light pointing down with a shadow here on the bottom of the bubble and highlight more on the top of the bubble. So we have our first set of bubbles animated. With this set up, I'm going to try to speed things up a little bit, and I'm just going to select that layer and duplicate it, Control D or Command D. We'll go to Bubbles 1 right there on the top and hit the Enter key, and I'm going to label that to Bubbles 2. So with Bubbles 2 layer there, we're going to need to make a few adjustments to it. So let's go up here to the Effects palette, take a look at it, Birth Rate. Let's change the birth rate to 0.4. And we'll leave the longevity at 15. Let's go into the producer and make some adjustments there. On the x-axis, let's set that at a negative 0.35. And then on the y-axis, let's set that at a 0.21. We'll leave the z-axis as is, and then let's go down to the radius x and set that to a 0.01. And for our y radius, let's set that at a 0.48. And on our z-axis, let's set that at 0.07. So you'll see here we've set the producer in more of a vertical position. Let's move from the producer now to the physics, and we want to change the animation type from explosive to vortex. The velocity we'll set at 0.2. We'll leave the inverse velocity at 0. Let's set the gravity to a negative 0.2. And the resistance we'll leave at 5. On the particle, let's make a few adjustments there. Let's set the birth size at 0.15 and the death size at 0.1. Then we should be able to leave everything else as it is. And what we've created is this vertical flow of smaller particles concentrated in this area right here. Let's take a look at that. So now we can move on to Bubbles Layer 3. And I'm just going to duplicate Bubbles 2, Control D or Command D. And just like we did on Bubbles 2, let's go into our properties here and make a few adjustments. On the birth rate, let's set that back to 0.2. And on our longevity, let's set that up to 30. We'll go into the producer and make some adjustments. So on the position here for this, let's set X at 0.32. The Y position at a 0.27. We'll leave Z at 0. And then the radius, we're going to make adjustments to it. On the X radius, let's set that at 0.18. The Y radius 0.01. And we'll leave the Z radius as it is. So we've now moved over to the other side with a little bit larger flow of particles. Let's jump into the physics for this. And let's change from, on the animation type, from vortex to cone axis. And let's change the velocity to 0.01. Let's change the gravity to a negative 0.07. And the resistance, we'll set that at 1. And now we can jump into the particle. And we'll change the birth size, 0.13. And the depth size, we'll leave at 0.1. Take a look at that. So here we have it rendered out. We have all of our bubbles in place. We will add one more layer of bubbles a little bit later after we do our text. But for right now, this should work. I'm going to jump back to the original animation and take a look at it because there's a couple of things I want to point out. Take a look at the word dive as it comes in. It's animated with this radio wave coming across it. So we're going to need to create that transition there. And then the other two sets of text are created with a different transition. So let's take a look at creating those transitions. The transition for the word dive, we're going to need to actually start a new composition to create that. So let's go up to Composition, New Composition, and we will call this Transition for Dive. And we'll go with 1920 by 1080, 24 frames at 10 seconds. Hit OK on that. Here's our new composition. Let's go up and we'll need a new solid, layer, new, solid. And let's call this radio waves. Now I want to add the effect radio waves to this layer. I'm going to select that layer. I'm going to come over here to Effects and Presets and search for radio waves. And there it is. It's under Generate. I'm going to grab this, drag it down, and drop it on that solid right there. Let's animate first the frequency of this from 0 to 105 in about 16 frames here. So with the timeline indicator here at the beginning, we're going to set our first keyframe on frequency. I'm going to bring that down to 0. And then we'll move in about 16 frames. So we'll find that there's 16 frames, and then we'll bring that frequency up to 105. And then we're going to set this expansion right here. We're not going to animate it, but just set this expansion to 180. After we've animated that, let's make a few more changes to this. Let's open up Stroke here and go to Profile, and let's change that to Gaussian. And then we're going to need to change the color here to white. And let's change this fade out time to 2.5. And then our start width is going to be 100. Then we can jump back and take a look at this animation. So what that does is creates this animation of going from black to almost white. Now, this is not allowing us to fill in all of these areas with white. So what we're going to do to finish this off is we're going to add another solid in here. So let's go up to Layer, New, Solid, and let's make this a white solid. and hit OK. We drop that in, and right here around 16 frames is where we want to start animating this in. So as our radio waves kind of come to a completion, we're going to fade this in on top of it to go completely white. So with this new white solid selected, let's hit T on the keyboard for opacity, and we're going to animate that opacity. So let's set a keyframe here, bring that down to 0, and then we'll jump in about 8 frames. That'll take us up to 24 frames right there at 1 second, and let's bring that up to 100%. And then we'll see our animation. So that will be our transition for the dive text. I'm going to jump back into our main composition, go look at my project panel here, and I'm going to grab that transition for dive and bring it down into the composition. You'll see it appear there, and we will use that in just a minute. But now what we need to do is create our dive text. So let's grab the text tool, click in there and type in dive, all caps. I'm using Avenir Next Heavy. It's at 400 pixels. You can find something that similar to that. I'm going to bring it over and line it up so I can kind of get an idea of where this is. I'm going to bring my title safe up, and that looks pretty centered there. Get rid of my title safe. So make sure that this composition transition for dive is on top of the dive text, and then we're going to tell the dive text to use that transition for dive as a track matte, but we're going to use Luma Matte. I'm going to bring my timeline indicator back just a little bit so I can see these ripples in the dive text. And you notice how it seems like the center of it is down here. Of course it is, because of the way that we built this transition here. And so what I'm going to do is go to position on this transition for dive, and I'm going to bring that up till I feel like that. Yeah, there we go. Got that center point right there in the middle of the dive text. And now let's take a look at that. Now I have my dive text in there and I have it animated, but one thing is it's kind of blending into the background here. So I'm going to add an effect to the dive text. I'm going to select the dive text and go to Effect and Perspective, and I'm going to put a drop shadow in here. I'm going to stay with black on that, but I'm going to make a few changes to this. The distance I'm going to drop to 0, and then the softness I'm going to increase to about 30%. And that just brings out kind of a soft line around the entire text, helps it to just pop out a little bit. The animation in of the dive text is occurring a little early, so what I'm going to do is, with the transition, I'm going to grab that layer and I'm going to drag it back to about 2 seconds into the timeline here. That's where I want this animation to begin, because at the beginning of the entire animation, we're going to have the whole scene animate in. So that'll start about 2 seconds in. And then the next thing that we're going to need to do is we're going to need to build the transition for our other 2 layers of text. Let's go back to our original and take a look at it. So there's the dive text coming in, and then into the deep is a transition that is affecting both of those 2 layers of text. So that's what we're going to go create now. So we're going to need to start a new solid. Let's go up to Layer, New, Solid, and let's type in transition for into deep. Let's make this a black solid. Hit OK on that. We want to add the effect Mr. Mercury. So I'm going to come over here again to my effects and presets, and I'm going to type in MR, and there it is, Mr. Mercury, CC Mr. Mercury. We'll grab that and drop it on. You can see the look that this effect creates as we let it play through. So we're going to make some adjustments to this. First thing I want to do is radius X. I want to change that to 90. And then radius Y, we're going to animate that. So with our timeline indicator at the beginning of the timeline, with that layer selected, let's go up to radius Y and let's click the stopwatch to set that first keyframe. Let's set that property at 10. And then let's jump in 2 seconds into the timeline and let's set that keyframe at 35. If you want to see those keyframes, we can select that layer and hit the U key, and that'll show us that we have those 2 keyframes animated there. The producer here, let's change the position of it just slightly and bring it up to 414 on the y-axis. And the birth rate, let's set that at 27.7. And the longevity on this, let's set that to 10. Gravity, we're going to drop that to 0. The birth size, let's change that to 0.19. And the depth size, let's set that to 0.5. And now what we'll do, similar to our transition for dive, we're going to slide this layer back to, let's set it around 209 in the timeline. And so what will happen is, now right now we don't have our text in there, but you'll see how that is going to evolve. And let's go ahead and get our text typed in. And I'm going to bring that transition for Into the Deep on top of our text layer there. And now we can set the track matte to alpha matte. And we'll see that begin to animate in. And then we're going to need our next text layer to speed things up. We can duplicate the word dive, Control D. And let's bring that on up above this transition into the deep. Let's drop it right above there. And we're actually going to duplicate this one also, that transition into the deep. Control D. And we want to take that next second one and drop it above our dive text. I want to change this word from dive to deep. So I'm going to select that and type in deep, all capital letters. Get my selection tool, and I'm going to shift and drag this down by using the arrow keys. I'm going to select no track matte there right now so I can see this, and I'm going to make an adjustment to it on the size. I'm going to bring that size down to 372. Now back to the word deep here. I'm going to go to it and select track matte and make sure that it has alpha matte selected also. So to explain what we've done, I've set up the text here into on a separate layer, and I've used that first transition into the deep as its transition, and then duplicated or set up my next word deep here and duplicated this transition, set it above, so that now we're using that also as an alpha matte or transition for the word deep. So we have into that text layer there with its transition, and then we have the word deep with its transition. So let's see how that is working out. And so we have the transition for Into the Deep. The effect kind of lingers on a little bit too long here for me. So what I want to do is I want to try to fade out that transition before it gets to this point. To do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop in around 410 on the composition. So what I'm looking at is the transition into deep for the word deep. And I'm going to come down here to the compositing options, and I'm going to hit the plus button so that I add a mask reference in, and then I'm going to animate this effect opacity. To do that, again, I'm at 410 in the composition. I'm going to set the stopwatch there for effect opacity. Going to jump about 10 seconds into the timeline and then bring that opacity down to 0. And that will fade this effect out and bring the rest of the word deep in completely. So we have our background, we have 3 layers of bubbles, and what I want to do is I want to add a little more effect to this, and I want to bring some bubbles on top of our text layers here. To do that, I'm going to come down here to Bubbles 1, and I'm going to duplicate it, Control D. And then I'm going to drag Bubbles 1, that new layer that we just created, all the way to the top above our 3 layers of text, but I'm going to keep it underneath that adjustment layer. So let's relabel this Bubbles 4. I'm going to select it, hit the Enter key, and Bubbles 4. It's a duplication of Bubbles 1, and what I want to do is, since the bubbles here are the exact same ones as Bubble 1, I'm going to go in and make an adjustment so that there's variation in them. So with Bubbles 4 layer, I'm going to go to the properties for Bubbles 4, go to Effects, and double click on CC Particle World to make sure that it's open up here in the Effects panel. And I'm going to drop down here to Extras. And then this phrase right here, Random Seed. I'm just going to adjust that. We can adjust that to pretty much any number. I'm just going to type in 90. What this does is randomly mixes up the bubbles. This changes them so that they're not exactly like the Bubbles 1 layer. All right, so we have a pretty nice field of bubbles. We have the text animating in, but in the original composition, we'll go take a look at that real quick. This transitions in from black. To finish this out, we'll need to create a new composition. So go up to Composition, New Composition, and let's label this Final Dive. And we'll go with 19, 20, 10, 80, 24 frames, 10 seconds. Hit OK on that. And let's add a new solid in, Layer, New, Solid. And we will call this Main Transition. And we're going to use Mr. Mercury again. So with that layer selected, we can come over here to Effects, Presets. I already have it still in the search. I'm going to drag that down, drop it on, and we'll scrub in a little bit. There's Mr. Mercury. We're going to make a few changes to this. So we're going to go to Radius X, and we're going to animate that. So let's, at the beginning of the timeline, set a keyframe for Radius X. Set that at 45. Let's jump 2 seconds in and set that second keyframe to 90. And then back at the beginning, let's go to Radius Y and animate that. Set the first one at 10. Jump to 2 seconds again. And let's animate that to 74. Let's change our birth rate to 28. Our longevity to 10. Gravity to 0. Let's start with the birth size of 0.47. And the death size, let's bring that up to 1.47. And then on this one again, we're going to need to animate the opacity of this effect. So to do that, we're going to actually need to go down into the timeline, come down into Effects, Mr. Mercury, and down at the bottom, let's add a mask reference and then animate this effect opacity. We'll start right here at 2 seconds in, click that stopwatch at 100%, and let's move forward about 10 frames, and we'll bring that down to 0. So keep in mind that when we apply this using Track Matte, that the layer underneath it is going to be looking at the alpha information, all of this blank information here, and it's going to start appearing underneath all of this black information right here. So this is telling that layer where to appear. So I'm going to close that up. And now all we need to do is go into our project panel and get our comp 1 right here. Bring that down, drop it in. And with comp 1 in there underneath our main transition, we'll go to track matte. We'll do alpha matte. And I'm going to turn my transparency grid off and let that animate. So in this tutorial, what we've accomplished is we've created some pretty organic looking transitions using effects in After Effects and then also using the track matte. We've also created our background using a couple of effects, one being fractal noise and the other one being CC particle world. I hope this tutorial's been helpful. Thanks for watching, and for a more in-depth look at motion media design with After Effects, check out my other tutorials.